Well, good morning. We're here today to interview Horace Randall Williams on his amazing life journey, starting in rural Chambers County. Well, Randall, there's a lot to say, and I'm going to be asking you some broad questions, which I'm hoping you'll fill in with all the detail, a lot of detail that will be telling of your growing up experiences. To start, tell us, who are you? Give us, as a context for this conversation, a brief overview of your growing up years and work life and career. Just the arc of the journey, briefly, please.
Okay. Well, I'm from rural East Alabama, Chambers County. I mostly grew up there, lived a few other places for short periods of time, but mostly grew up there. Went to public school there. Then I went to college and started into journalism as a job and a career in Birmingham. I was there for a couple of years working, and then I came to Montgomery and went and worked for the newspaper here, the Alabama Journal, the afternoon daily at that time. Then I spent a decade, more or less, at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and then I went into business for myself, publishing magazines and newspapers and doing newsletter work, that sort of thing. And then I started publishing books, accidentally, but I started publishing books, and books became the thing that I have done for the past 3+ decades. And along the way, I had more than one marriage, children, relationships, community work, and am happy to be here.
That's great. You're from Chambers County, and you've made a point about that. And why is Chambers County significant in your life? And tell us a little bit about what it was like at the time when you were a child there.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Chambers, obviously we're all shaped by where we come from, and Chambers County certainly shaped me in ways that are, I think, mostly good, but were interesting, to say the least. I probably should say a little bit about why Chambers County fits into the Alabama history and the Southern history as it does. So Chambers is in East Alabama, it's about 80 miles northeast of Montgomery. And Chambers is on the Georgia line. It's bordered on one side by the Chattahoochee River on the east side, and it's bordered by the Tallapoosa River on the west side. And it's an interesting county in that it's the upper part of the county is the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's that part of the county is Appalachia, small farms, rocky land, and the bottom part of the county is more black belt. Flatter, more expansive plots of land, cotton farming. There was cotton farming all over, but you didn't really have up in the upper part of the county, you didn't have plantations. You had smaller farms that were more like the Appalachian counties of Alabama. And that influenced the population of the county as well as what people did. Originally, of course, it was Indian country, the Creek Indians, for the most part. And the place is full of rivers. All of Alabama is, but Chambers County certainly has rivers, creeks, and very easy to see how the Indian culture was so dominant in that area. And then, of course, came the removal of the Indians so completely that growing up, we weren't taught anything about Indian culture, didn't know anything about it, didn't know anybody who was an Indian, or had Indian heritage. The removal had been quite complete, and of course that process of Indian removal and the settlement of those places there were were a part of the story of Alabama history involving slavery and agriculture, and that was a big part of it. And then later, and we'll maybe come back to it, but later there developed the cotton mill culture, which was present in the county seat, Lafayette, and significantly down on the along the Chattahoochee River there, where there were this string of cotton mill towns, starting on the Georgia side with West Point, Georgia, and then in quick succession, Lynette, Shawmut, Langdale, Fairfax, and Riverview. There were cotton mills in all these places. So that as time went by, lots and lots of people in the county, even up in my part of the county, which was more northwest Chambers County, there were a lot of people there who worked in the cotton mills down in the valley. So there's that aspect of it, and then you began to drill down to the economics and the cultural conditions that are affected by slavery. And again, growing up, in the white community at least, which is my culture, we were unaware. We were not taught. It wasn't talked about. What we knew about slavery was very little. It's telling that in the Alabama textbooks of that time period, I was born in 1951, so I was going to school in the 50s and 60s. I was going to public school there, and the textbooks that we used in our schools, they had a paragraph or two about slavery, and that was it. And and it was the myth of the kind master and the happy slave. That was basically what we were taught. We weren't taught any of the rest, but it was all around us. So the population of the county is. Especially in from the center of the county down to the bottom edge of the county, heavily black. Lafayette, the county seat, was close to 50% black, and was that true historically? It probably was, and of course, historically, at the beginning of the history of the place, it would have been. The slave population would have been a large part of the population of the county. Again, the Indians have been removed now, so what you got left are whites and blacks. And then came the end of slavery and the end of Reconstruction, and then you had the long period before the Civil Rights started. You had the long period of the Jim Crow culture, which was prevalent all across the South, and certainly across Alabama, and certainly in Lafayette. I should digress just a little bit to say that the name Lafayette and that the pronunciation Lafayette, that's how we know whether or not you're from there. it's named after the Marquis, the Marquis de Lafayette, and his name. And all across the country there are Lafayette towns, and most places they're spelled with a small F, and they're pronounced Lafayette, Louisiana, and so forth. But in Alabama and in Georgia, there are two towns, and they're spelled with a capital F, and they're pronounced Lafayette. But anyway, named after the general because Alabama became a state in 1819, and then in about 1820s, 25 or so, Lafayette made his triumphant tour of the then small United States after his tour 50 years after the Revolution, the American Revolution, and all over the places were named in his honor, the Lafayette. And wherever you see a LaGrange, that's also named in his honor. LaGrange, Texas, LaGrange, Georgia, LaGrange, Tennessee, because in France, the Marquis' family estate was named LaGrange. So that's where those come from. And I make a mention of that because Lafayette was home, really, the two most famous people from Lafayette, which is where I graduated high school and where once we moved from the really rural area into what I thought was at the time was the big city. The two most famous people from Lafayette are polar opposites. There's Cotton Tom Heflin, who at one time I think was mayor of Lafayette, and then he eventually was in the United States Senate, and he was one of the most virulent racist demagogues of the early 20th century. Well, he's from there. And who else? Joe Louis Barrow, the famous boxer, the Brown Bomber. He was born in rural Chambers County, not too far from Lafayette, and he lived there until he was about 12, and then he went to Detroit, and then eventually he became famous and internationally famous. Anyway, so the point I guess I'm getting at is that the culture, the population, the people were black and white, and they lived in close proximity, and yet were totally separate all through my growing up years. So I was raised and grew up in the white Alabama racist culture. And this is a product of and symbolic of segregation and the Jim Crow culture and history. Now there are, as I later would learn through my work in journalism and activism, and history, I would learn that there are many different kinds of racism, and to say that I grew up as an Alabama white racist, I grew up in what I believe was, I will call it cultural racism. The mythology that and belief that had built up from the beginning of slavery was that of white superiority, black inferiority, and this was, as common as the water that we drank. And, it really influenced everything. Excuse me. You understood it. You breathed it. you were born into it, and it was hard to get out of it. Now, I'm speaking not for the black people that I knew and were friends with and lived close to. I'm speaking about the white
Right.
culture. And I want to make the distinction between cultural racism, which is what I'm describing in a roundabout way, because that belief was, it was just, it was there. It was, and very, very few people questioned it. There's very, very few white people I'm talking about here. Questioned it, understood it, had reservations, particularly about it. There is a strain of ideological and philosophical racist. These are the people who populated the Ku Klux Klan, to some extent the White Citizens Council, organizations like that.
Right.
These racist and encompassed violence, as well. These were racist who were cultural racist, to be sure, because that is where that is what they grew up in and understood. But they went beyond that to a set of beliefs which often led to a set of actions that were more vitriolic, more determined, more aggressive forms of racism.
Right.
I don't think that my own upbringing was much influenced by that latter part. I think it was more the cultural parts. And I probably can come up with examples of what I mean by some of that.
Like, how did it express itself? How did that kind of racism express itself in your,
right,
in your daily life? What did you see?
Right. Okay. How that racism manifested itself in daily life and living was both legal and extra legal. We, of course, had slavery, which was a legal system as well as a cultural system, and that was replaced by after the brief period of more equality and justice and Reconstruction, which was done away with by whites acting under the cultural racism and sometimes the philosophical racism. So then we had the long Jim Crow period, and the separation between the black and the white communities was then legal as well as cultural, until the legal parts were overthrown by the successes of the civil rights movement. So, and how did that work in daily life? And I shall say that legally, the inability of African American citizens to vote, to marry who they chose, to live where they wanted to live, to hold jobs that they wanted to hold, to get educations that they wanted to have. All of those were all of those things were influenced by both the legal and the cultural restraints and of the time. so that if you went up to the courthouse in Lafayette, the Chambers County Courthouse, and you went into the building, you saw white water fountain and a colored water fountain. You saw white bathrooms and colored bathrooms. And then if you went into stores, for example, if you went into a clothing store in downtown Lafayette, you would see that blacks were not waited on. They had to wait to be waited on. If there was clothing that they were interested in buying, they could buy it. If they had the money to buy it, they could buy it. But they weren't allowed to try on clothing. And I'm talking about Lafayette, but I mean this is not a circumstance unique to Lafayette. I mean it's unique to all the towns and places in the Deep South and maybe in other parts of the United States as well, where Jim Crow law and practice, was the rule of the day. And there are other, small, petty, often petty, but cutting things that happen to people. The lack of courtesy titles for African Americans. No matter what their age is. Black men and women were not referred to as, Mrs. Jane Smith or whatever. It would be just Jane. The Mrs. was not allowed to be applied to that, or at least it was not applied. Now, was this universal? It was not universal. There were exceptional, there were exceptional people, and as I got older, I came to meet some of them who would, not do those discriminating things, but in general, the white Alabama culture of which I was a part, it practiced these sometimes severe and sometimes petty forms of discrimination. And then you have, for example, what I observed with my maternal grandparents, so my maternal grandparents were Grady and Fanny Smith. My grandmother, Fanny Smith, who had been a Sanders, she was a Sanders who married a Smith. Interestingly, her mother had been a Smith who married a Sanders, and then she was a Sanders who married a Smith.
I don't know how you keep straight, keep it all straight.
Yeah, I don't think this was an incestuous kind of thing. It just means that there were lots of Smiths and Sanders running around in the places where they lived. But, my grandmother Fanny, by the way, was born in 1912. And that was, I didn't know this as a child, but I've learned it as an adult. That was a period when Woodrow Wilson was he president in 1912? I think he was president. And he was the first Southerner to be elected president since the early founding fathers. And he was very, very popular in the South. So Fanny Smith's actual name is Woodrow Wilson Sanders Smith. So, but she was called Fanny. Anyway, so these people were very, very poor. They were sharecroppers. They had fourth grade educations. That was as far as either of them went. They married when Granddad was born in 1909. She was born in 1912, and she was 16 when they married, and so he would have been 19. And they lived as sharecroppers in whatever house they could find, and they probably moved from place to place. Granny probably was born in Tallapoosa County, which is the neighboring county to Chambers. But by the time they were married and established and had children, started having children, they had moved. They were in Chambers County, and they sharecropped here. They had to move. They sharecropped somewhere else, and then they had $3, over time, and they eventually got a little. They were able to get a little farm of their own. They had a rocky little 55-acre farm in northwest Chambers County, almost in Randolph County, not too far from the Tallapoosa River. And interestingly, they were able to keep this farm. It was hard to keep the farm. It was hard to make enough money to keep the farm. And so for a number of years, they would go in the winters to Florida to work as migrant laborers, picking oranges for the most part. Granny also worked in a nursery where they grew plants and things like that. But they would do that. They would manage to make enough money to keep up the payments on their farm, and then they would go back home, and Granddaddy would farm in the plant and harvest months until it got cold again, and he'd go back to Florida. Okay, so here you have this couple, Grady and Fanny Smith, with their $3, of which the middle one is my mother, Ellen Maureen Smith, married Horace Williams, and I'm their first child. And I was the first child of my grandparents on the maternal side, their first grandchild. And I spent a lot of time growing up around them and at their farm. In fact, my own parents, my mother was 14 when she married my father, and now she was almost 17 when I was born. I don't know how they kept from having me sooner, but they did. My father was older, which is kind of interesting, and I'll come back and talk about that. He was 26 and she was 14. She was 12 years younger than him. Now, my Granny Smith was born in 1912. Daddy was born in 1922. So he's actually closer in age to her than he was to her daughter, who he married. And they consented to their marriage, but they insisted that Mama and Daddy live with them in their house until for a while, and Daddy was to help, on the farm and stuff, which he did. I'm getting off the track here, but I'm telling about them because I want to bring that back to the racial aspect. So here were Grady and Fanny Smith with their little 55-acre farm, and their closest neighbors were a black couple named Matthew and Little A. what her real name was, I don't really know. Little A is what we always called her. What their last names were, I honestly don't know. It's astonishing that I don't, but I never knew their last names. But they lived very close to each other. And I will say that to get to their respective farms, Grady Smith had a 55-acre little rocky farm. Matthew Matthew, whatever his last name was, had a 50-acre farm, and they were very, they were very similar, and really they were kind of across the dirt road and up the hill from each other. And to get there, you went north out of Lafayette for about 15 miles to a little community called Abanda, A-B-A-N-D-A. And Abanda's the next little town of any size from it was Wadley, Alabama, and interestingly, the Heflin family, Senator, I had mentioned Cotton Tom Heflin, and his nephew, Howell Heflin, both of them became United States senators. The Heflin family is from that area, which is just down the road. But if you went out of Lafayette and you drove north toward Wadley and toward Randolph County, and you were almost up there, you come to a railroad. And if you go about 150 yards past that railroad, where next to the railroad there were two little country stores and several churches, white churches, by the way. And then you turn to the right on this little dirt road, and then you go about a mile and a half down that dirt road. Then first you come to, up on top of the hill, you come to Matthew's farm, and then you go a little bit down a hill, and to the right there's Grady's farm. Now this is on a dirt road. There was a long time before Alabama had any paved roads, but eventually we did get some paved roads. But most people lived not on paved roads. A lot of in the farming areas, they lived on dirt roads. And if you turn to the right off of Highway 77 and head toward these two farms I'm talking about, you get on some pavement, and that pavement went for about a half mile till you came to a little bridge across a creek, and then that pavement ended. Now that paving was a result of Big Jim Folsom's farm to market road program, which one of his accomplishments as a governor, a man who was progressive, ahead of his time. He had this farm to market program. He paved a lot of these roads because the dirt roads were a problem for farmers because in rainy season these roads were impassable, and so you couldn't get your crops out and take them to market. And so anyway, so you go along and you come to the little bridge, and that pavement ends, and then the pavement resumes on the other side of the bridge, a different kind of pavement, because that next stretch of about another half mile or so was paved during Jim Folsom's second administration. And then that ends, and then you're back on the dirt, and then you come to the Matthew farm and the Grady farm.
Okay.
All right. Now, I'm going on about this because as a child, I had no understanding of this really, but I observed it. Here were these two guys, about the same ages. One guy white, one guy black, and they are out there every day. They're plowing their fields, they're planting their cotton, they're planting their corn. They are doing whatever the chores are that you have to do on a farm. And of course, these people were largely self-sufficient on both sides, both the black and the white, were largely self-sufficient small farmers. There were no big, to my knowledge, no big cotton plantations anywhere around in their part of the county. Now again, in the south part of the county there were.
Right.
Had there been, slaves up in that part of the county, it's not recorded or talked about or discussed in my family background. So I, don't really know. We do know from Leah Rawls Atkins and her work that almost all whites in Alabama in slavery time did own slaves. Interestingly, there were even of the few Indians who were left, some of them in the slavery territories, some of them also owned slaves, which I'm not a historian who's studied this enough to talk about it, but I do know, that some of that existed. But in my own background, the slavery aspect was never really discussed. What was practiced, though, was those forms of cultural segregation, because even though Grady and Matthew were out there doing the same kind of work, and they lived right next to each other, I have often wondered what they talked about, what they did. They would be at each other's houses, and around each other's property all the time. I'd see them out there. I never saw Matthew and Little A inside my grandparents' house. They would visit on the porch. They would visit in the yard. And that kind of a thing, but they were around, and when you're out there farming by yourself, I mean, it's hard work. I suppose it's kind of boring, work in some ways. And I know that Matthew would help Grady harvest the corn. In other words, Matthew would come and help Grady harvest his corn, and then Grady would go up and help Matthew harvest his corn. What are they talking about? I don't know, but they had a neighborly kind of a congenial relationship, it seemed to me. And when Matthew's barn burned, Grady helped him build it back. Why? I assume it's because they were neighbors. Now, when they went to town, they went into different worlds. They went away from their world. And when I say town, Lafayette, when I was growing up, was 3,000, 3,500 people. We lived, my family lived out not too far from Abanda, way out in the country. It was so far out in the country that when I was riding the school bus, I was the first. My family, we were the first. I and my siblings were the first on the school bus in the morning and the last off in the afternoon, because we were removed from the school. And then I went until I was halfway through the 8th grade. I went to a little school called Chambers County High School, which was at Milltown, Alabama, which is between Lafayette and Abanda. I should mention, by the way, that Abanda, it's interesting because it's right on the railroad. It's right on the railroad tracks, and the name of the little community, Abanda, is named for the railroad. It was I think Atlanta, Birmingham, and Anniston Railroad, and so mushing together of the letters in those names is where the little place got its name. And there were like 100 people. That's all that lived there. And then everybody else lived around there out on the farms because everybody was farmers. So anyway, when I went to that Chambers County high school, which at the time when I was in the 8th grade, it was grades 1 through 12, and I think it might have been about 100 students in all 12 grades. So it was very, very small. And then we moved into Lafayette, population of about 3,500. I thought we were moving to the big city. And, it seemed so to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, did Grady ever say anything to you about his neighbor, about Matthew? Did you have any?
If there was explicit discussion, I don't remember
Okay.
it, and I'm not
Okay.
aware of it.
Okay.
But I watched them together, you
Right.
know, and I think even though it was unspoken, it helped me understand that these two families were really just alike, with the
Right.
exception of the colors of their skins and the circumstances that they lived in
Right.
because of the history and the culture. There is a later Fannie and Little A story that I'll tell you, again, a race relation story. But for the present, I'm really talking about the circumstances of sharecropping life in
Right.
rural Alabama, and that sharecropping as a system and small farming as a system was tough.
Right.
And it was tough on the small white farmers, and then it was even tougher, I believe, on the small black farmers, because they not only had to contend with the difficulties of small farming, but they had to contend with the social difficulties
Right.
of the segregation period.
Well, let me interrupt and say, okay, you've mentioned that they were poor. You described the farm, rocky, poor for farming, really, the house they lived in, and that your parents lived in for the first few years of their married life. Can you expand a little bit on what that house, describe the house? Did it have running water?
Right.
Did it tell us, just so we can visualize the circumstances better?
Okay. Well, first of all, it was my grandparents' house was the vernacular form is a dog trot house. It was a wood-framed house that had essentially it had a bedroom on one side of the dog trot, and on the back a little addition built onto it that whatever it was used for, storage or whatever. And then on the other side, it had another, on the other side of the dog trot, it had another bedroom. And then on the front part of the house, it had one more room that was a kitchen. So it essentially was a 3-room house. And the years that my mother and father lived with her parents, both of her sisters, by the way, both of Ellen Williams' sisters, were already gone to their households, their own households.
Married, you mean?
Married.
Right.
Actually, I take it back. Certainly, Cenas, the older, was. Lenora, the youngest, would not have been married. If Mama was 14 when she married, she would have been about 12. She wouldn't have been married yet. I don't know where she was. I guess by the time I was aware of them, she was married and gone. But at any rate, they lived there in this little small house. And it was a wood frame house, and it was a dog trot. they had rural electrification had come to even the remote parts of Alabama by then, and in their house they had a single light bulb suspended from the ceiling in each room of the house. If they had any outlets, I'm not aware of it, any outlets where you'd plug in things. They must do. I guess actually they did, because they had, they had radio, they had lamps, and, so there were some outlets, but not much, and there was no indoor plumbing. Now, I want to make the distinction that the same would have been true in Matthew's house as in Grady's house. Was Matthew's house a dog trot? I don't remember that. But they were very poor. Both of these families were very poor, and yet in some ways they were not poor, because they had plenty to eat. They had everything they needed. They had cows that they milked. They had chickens. They had pigs. They grew not only the cotton and the corn, which were commercial crops, as well as, and the corn was for feed for the animals as well, but it was also commercial. And my Grady also grew peanuts, which he would sell, and he grew. But they grew all these vegetables. They had an extensive garden, and they grew everything. They had a scuppernong arbor. They grew. Peas, beans, peppers, onions, okra, tomatoes, you name it, they grew it. And that was also true for for Matthew, as well as Matthew and Grady. That was true for both of them. And their wives, both Fanny and Little A, worked. They probably did more of the work in the garden than did the men, and they also worked in the fields. They worked in the cotton growing. They worked in that, both of them. So even though they were very poor in terms of dollars that came in, they had a pretty good life in terms of what they ate. I remember sumptuous, what felt to me like sumptuous meals. They would, Grady would get up in the morning, and he would start a fire in the wood stove, and then he would head out to the barn, and pretty soon Fanny would follow him to the barn after she got biscuits and things like that started for breakfast. She would follow him to the barn, milk the cow, and then she would come back and prepare the meal, and then she would set about doing her household things while he went to the field. And at lunchtime, though, he'd come back to the house, and there would be on the table in the summer months, particularly, there'd be, fried chicken, ham, cornbread, biscuits left over from breakfast, butter beans, peas, tomatoes, okra, all this food and abundance of it, watermelon, cantaloupe, cucumbers, all there. Granddaddy would take his car, and he would load up the trunk of his car with surplus produce, because they grew more than they could eat. And some of it Granny would can. She was always canning. She would dry some things, like she dried apples in the sun, dried apples to make in the winter months. She'd make fried apple pies out of these dried apples that she had put away. But Granddaddy would take some stuff and he would go to Wadley and he would drive up and down the residential streets with the trunk of his car open real slowly, and housewives knew that they would see his car and so forth, and they'd come out and they'd buy some peas or some string beans or some tomatoes or whatever it was that he was selling. So you would do that. So my point is that these families were financially poor, but they and their children were pretty well fed because they could grow what they needed there.
Describe your paternal your paternal grandparents,
Right.
and they were farmers too, correct?
They were.
And what were the similarities and differences?
Right. Let me back up one more thing about my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, though, and I mentioned the electricity and so forth,
Right.
and they had a wood stove and they had fireplaces, wood
right.
fireplaces. That's what they
Right.
heated with in the winter. There was no air conditioning, of course. You just had screens on the windows, and the house was open as much as you could, and you get cross ventilation, which was part of the purpose of a dog trot house, was
Right.
to allow more ventilation. Because Alabama is, as you have learned since you moved here, Alabama is hot.
Right.
So.
And you said the plumbing, no indoor plumbing.
No indoor plumbing. They had an outhouse, down the hill a little bit from the house and away from the well house. So they had a well house, and it had a windlass operated rope and bucket. You would let the bucket down into the well and let it fill up with water, and then you pull it up, and all day long you're doing that, all day long. And the wood stove has a compartment on the side of it that you fill up with water, and then as the fire cooks the food, it's also heating the water, and that's the water you use for cooking, for cleaning, and it's the water people bathed in, as well. So you got hot water to take a bath and a number 3 wash tub that you got in, as often as custom and tradition and habit led you to. So that's sort of my maternal grandparents' existence. Now, my paternal grandparents, Steve and Vistera Williams, they lived on a little farm. They had started out as sharecroppers as well, and they had lived on a little farm that was about, probably as the crow flies, maybe 8 miles or so from where my maternal grandparents' farm was. Now, Stephen Vistera, and he was 10 years older than her, by the way. A key difference in what became of them, this is my father's family, a key difference of them has to do with their children. Steve had started out with a little small farm as well, but Grady Smith had 3 daughters. That's all he had. And the daughters were not farmhands. They were not capable of, not that they didn't work, they did work, but they were not farm laborers in the way that boys would have been or that boys were. Steve and Vestera had 12 children. 9 of whom were boys. So he grew, he raised a labor force of his own. He eventually got up to about 200 acres of land that he cultivated and raised stuff. He was able to build a bigger house, a more prosperous house. They did have, in my growing up years, they did have indoor plumbing. They still cooked on a wood stove. In fact, Granny Williams had 2 wood stoves because if you've got a family of 12 children and they had taken in 6 children that were the children of one of Granddaddy's brothers, and Granddaddy's brother and his wife were killed in a car accident, leaving 6 children. And so Granny and Granddaddy Williams took them in for a total of 18 children. Granny would make, and she had 3 daughters who, as they got older, helped in this labor. I don't know about the other 6 children. I don't know whether they were, what ages they were or whatever. There were not 18 children living there all at one time. Because my youngest uncle on the Williams side, Norman, he has nephews older than himself. Right. So there was a wide range of ages in there. So some of the older ones were grown by the time the younger ones were there. But even so, it was a big, really big family. And Granddaddy Williams would take advantage of that because he could put these boys to work. And they did all work until they went off got married and left, or as 3 of them went to World War II. Right. My father, his uncle, his brother Harold, and his brother Curtis. The oldest of them, John Henry, died at age 17 of pneumonia. But there were 11 left. And there's only 1 of them left now. The other, all of them are dead, with the exception of the youngest, Norman, who's in his mid to late 80s at this point, and still doing, reasonably well. All of them lived into their, except for the one that died of pneumonia, all of them lived into, ripe old ages, in their 80s. But it was a more prosperous kind of a family and upbringing, not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but more prosperous. One of the interesting things about Steve Hubbard Williams, my father's father, is that during the Great Depression, when money was so hard to come by and jobs were so, hard to get, he somehow had managed to get a job in the Lynette bleachery and dye works in one of the cotton mills down in the Chattahoochee Valley. It's still in Chambers County, but it's down in what's the valley, almost in Georgia. And he had managed to get a job there. And interestingly, that would have been in the late 30s, I guess, when he had this job there. And when I was 16, I got a job briefly in in the same cotton mill. I didn't work there long enough to decide there must be something better to do for a living. But I met a couple of old guys who were still working there in the 1960s who remembered Steve Hubbard Williams because he would come to work on Monday morning and he would work 40 hours without stopping. Then he would go home and farm the rest of the week. And then he'd come back the next week and do that again. And, he was, remembered for doing that. And it helped him make enough money. He never went to Florida and became a orange picker or migrant farmer because he was able to make a little money during those tough years. So there were differences in the circumstances of those two families. Not big differences, but some difference, and I attribute it to the fact that Granddaddy Williams was able to be more successful because he had all these strong boys that he had given birth to, that my grandmother had given birth to, and they were able to exploit that labor. Now, racially, they were just as much cultural racist, I believe, as my maternal grandparents, as their world. But they didn't have, in the years that I remember, there were no black families living right next to them in proximity to their own farm. And I didn't spend as much time with them as I did with Grady and Fanny. So I don't have the sort of memories of their interaction with blacks as I do with my maternal grandparents.
Right.
But the two families knew each other. My grandmother Smith, she would tell stories about, here would come Steve Williams down the road in his pickup truck with the back of the truck, full of all these blonde-headed heads sticking up above the cattle, the cattle thing on the back of the truck. And so she knew all them, and apparently my mother and my father met in church. In the little country church, and of course my father at that point, I do not to this day understand really how they ever got married and became a couple and got married. My father was a combat veteran of World War II and of Korea. He was recalled to go to the Korean War, but he had, as a young man, about age 20, he had gone into the Army. He either was drafted or knowing he was going to be drafted, he had signed up. But he did his basic training on the West Coast and then immediately was shipped to North Africa, and then went over to, I believe, Sicily, and then they started up, and so he was an infantryman, and so he basically walked from Sicily to almost to Austria by the end of the war. He had seen the world. He had been, he'd been in these intense experiences. And he comes home and he marries a 14-year-old. Okay, now I get it. She was young. She was pretty. She was, fun, I guess, to be with, all those things. But, how a 26-year-old man who has seen the things that my father had seen take up with a 14-year-old child is a little beyond me. But he did, and and that's that was my family background.
Can you spend a little time describing, telling us about you? What were I want to understand, what were your school experiences, starting in the elementary school and going up to high school. Give us a sense as to your your growth, your evolution during that time.
Okay. Let me say that some of my earliest memories are of the living out in this rural Alabama settings with on the farms. And even though my father, he always had, we always grew stuff, and we had, it was a farming life. But he had come back from the war. He had come back from World War II, and he had worked in the himself in the cotton mill, maybe done some other things, I don't know. And then he married my mother, and then he worked on Granddaddy Smith's farm until he was recalled to go to Korea. And in point of fact, Mama was pregnant with me, I believe, when he left for Korea, and he was there for a year. And when he got back, I was 6 months old when he got back, and she and I were living still with Granny and Granddaddy there at that time. Then he took the GI Bill and he went to Nashville, Tennessee, to diesel mechanic school. And he learned how to be a diesel mechanic, and then he came back and he did a number of jobs. I didn't realize until later how much his World War II experiences had affected him. Way more than Korea. The Korea was just something he did for a year, and he had Purple Hearts, I think, from both wars. But the World War II experience was the one that really, really affected him. Among other things, it made him restless, which I didn't understand until I was an adult. I didn't really connect those dots, but we moved a lot, and he changed jobs a lot. Often he'd go back to the same job and so forth. It was never without work. I mean, he could leave a job at 8 o'clock one day and have another job by 5 o'clock that afternoon, and he'd go to work the next day at another place. But he was always doing that. So I bring that up to say that I started actually school in Florida. We had moved to Florida, and he had become the manager of a little service station chain. And in those days, they really were little service stations. They weren't like today's convenience stores with gas pumps. They were little service stations. And he had become the manager of a company that was building a lot of new little stations. And he'd gotten a job to go in and supervise the building and putting in the equipment, and then hiring somebody to run it. And then when he had that person hired and trained a little bit, then we were moving on to the next place. So I started school in Florida, and I actually went to 6 different schools in the first grade. We lived in a house trailer. It was the kind of house trailer that really was a mobile home, because it could be pulled behind a car. I guess we had some sort of big car, like a Lincoln, a used Lincoln or something like that. And so, I'd go to school in the morning, and I'd come home in the afternoon, and the car would be hooked up to the trailer, and we'd take off. And then the next day, I'd go to school at a different school. And seemed normal to me. I mean, I thought that's the way school worked. But then we moved back to Alabama, and so I was in Alabama in the public schools in Chambers County for grades 2 and 3, and then we moved to Georgia for a year or a year and a half, and so I went to a little school in Georgia. And then we came back to Chambers County again, and then I was in Chambers County the rest of my, school years. So, what I was doing was what kids do, except it was colored by being, out on the farm and being in that rural, education. I did not have, in my early years, I didn't, even though, I knew, as I explained, I knew the black family lived up the hill, and I knew some other black families, around, but I really didn't have many playmates. Of course, I had siblings, and I had cousins, and I played with them. I had a lot of cousins. I have 50 first cousins. So you didn't lack for playmates, but it was family oriented. And, we living on the farm, we worked. If I could drive a bush hog, a tractor and a bush hog from the time I was 7 or 8 years old. And I would, when we lived, before we moved into Lafayette, into the big city, every morning I milked a cow before I went to school. When I came home and I raised chickens, I would...
Chickens?
Chickens.
All right, tell us about the
Interestingly, I would buy these baby chickens. I ordered them from Sears Roebuck. You'd go to school in the morning, get on the bus, and then you come home in the afternoon, and there underneath the mailbox be a box filled with 100 chirping
little
day-old baby chicks. And you raise them, start feeding them, and raising them, and by the time they're about 13 weeks old, they're big enough you can start eating them. When I'd come home in the afternoon, first thing I'd do is I'd catch 2 chickens and chop their heads off with an axe, and Mama would dress them, and we'd have chickens for supper, and saw wood for the wood burning fireplace. And
so she's still cooking on a wood stove?
no, my mother's not. My mother is cooking on a gas stove at that point.
Okay.
She had a gas stove.
Okay.
And let's see, I'm the oldest of 6 children, my two youngest sisters are not yet born, but there were 4 children and 2 adults, in the house. And the preacher would come by, and when he thought you'd have chicken dinner, he'd be by to visit and stay for dinner. That was, my growing up, a combination of going to school, working on the farm, and significantly reading. Read everything.
Tell us about your reading, please.
Well, my father was a reader also. Interestingly, he and all of his siblings, they had all graduated from high school. My mother never graduated from high school, nor did her younger sister. Her older sister did. Seen us graduate from high school and became a practical nurse, not a registered nurse, but a practical nurse. But all on my father's side, all of them had graduated from high school. None of them went to college, but they, all went to high school. My father liked to read, and he read quite a lot. And from my mother, I guess, read to me. I have very little memories of this, but I know I've been told that she read to me a lot. And so I grew up liking books a lot. And that little school I mentioned, the Chambers County High School, that I went through the halfway in the 8th grade, it had as you can imagine, a small library. But by the time I left and went to Lafayette High School, I had read every book in that library. And so I was becoming aware, even though I wasn't aware of it, I was becoming aware of the outside world
Right.
In that time period. And we had the bookmobile, which came,
Right.
and I would always ride my bicycle up to the little country store, which is about 6 miles away. I'd ride up there to where the bookmobile was going to be stopping, and I'd check out as many books as you could. So I was doing that. I played, baseball, which was the main sport we had. I did that, and I was looking after my younger brothers and sisters
Right.
as best I could,
Right.
and helping out, when I could, and that was what life was like.
Right. Two more questions relating to your school years, really. 1961, 1963, the years in which, the bombing of the Birmingham church, the Freedom Rides, the riot here in Montgomery, the march from Selma to Montgomery. Those events happened when you would have been 11, 12, 13, 14. Did you have any awareness of these, what was going on sort of in the more, elsewhere in Alabama, but in the national arena, really? Were you, was the family talking about these events? Did you hear about them in school?
Very little.
Okay.
I have told people that I'm, in a way, fortunate to have been too young for the civil rights kind of stuff, because there's a strong possibility that I would have been on the wrong side of the struggles because of my upbringing and where I lived. But I was, when the Freedom Rides came, I was 10. When the bombing in Birmingham happened, I was 12. When the Selma and Montgomery March, happened, I was 14.
Right.
Now, by age 14, I was old enough to be vaguely aware of these things, but they just were not, it was not a part of the fabric of what I was doing and what I was experiencing. As nearly as I could tell at that point, Brown v. Board now, Brown v. Board's in 54, and by 1965, we're 11 years after Brown v. Board, and yet it had extremely little effect in Chambers County, Alabama. We'll come to later the fact that the year I was a high school senior was the first year that they actually merged the black and white schools here. But my awareness of these events was quite remote.
Kennedy's passing, his assassination?
Kennedy's assassination is interesting because I was still at Chambers County High School in Milltown in November of 1963. And let's see, again, I was 12 years old. And this was that tiny little school, white school. I have no idea where the blacks in that area went to school. I don't have any knowledge of it, any memory of it, not in that part of the county. But on November the 22nd of 1963, early afternoon, we were called into the auditorium, school auditorium, which doubled as the basketball gym. We were called in there, and they had set up a little black and white TV. Now, we didn't have a TV at my house at that time. We didn't have a television until, as I recall, I was about 13 or so we didn't yet have a television. But at any rate, they had set up a little black and white television, and we all herded in there to watch it. And what we were watching was Walter Cronkite narrating the events around the president had been shot. And he had told people that the president had been shot. And so the news coverage is going on, and then shortly, in a little while, Cronkite soberly announces that President John F. Kennedy has died, and I remember quite distinctly that the older students, I was in the 7th grade, I guess, maybe the 8th, the older students and some of the teachers applauded and cheered. Now, I have come to count that as my first political moment. Now, I was just as racist as everybody else around me, but instinctively, that bothered me. You know, I knew that reaction was wrong. You know, I didn't have any comprehension of why it was happening. I didn't understand that. I now, in retrospect, you know, I understand that the Kennedys were hated by whites in Alabama. Interestingly, if you went into black households during this time period, I've seen pictures of this. It's not something I've observed myself at the time, but I've seen pictures, photographs of the interiors of black households. And if you went into the household, you would see groupings of 3 photographs hanging on the wall. And they'd be Jesus up on top, Martin Luther King, and John F. Kennedy. But the white Alabama community, by and large, hated the Kennedys because the white Alabamians believed that the Kennedys were civil rights, pushing civil rights on people, and that they were, to use the vernacular of the time, nigger lovers. And you know, let's talk about that word while we're on it. You know, now we refer to it as the N-word, but at that time in white Alabama, and I'll venture to say virtually all across white Alabama, the word was nigger. I used it. My family used it. The people in my church used it. Everybody used it. It was, every white person used it. Some more educated, sophisticated whites said Negra, which was a corruption, I guess, or amalgamation of Negro and nigger. So, and of course, people talked about colored people sometimes, but they also, the N word was the it was the common, it was common in the discourse, and so forth, and it was used casually in just conversation and whatever, and it would be used hatefully if there were disputes or whatever interactions. It would be used hatefully. But it was, that was a part of the culture. Now, that word eventually disappeared out of my own vocabulary. It gradually disappeared out of the vocabulary of all of my siblings, some more quickly than others, and it gradually disappeared out of the vocabulary of my parents. It never completely disappeared out of the vocabulary of some of my aunts and uncles and some of my cousins. But, this was a time in which, even though the myth of the lost cause had been, this great propaganda victory of the apologist for the Civil War, and the segregationist, even though, and that had been a very successful campaign, which none of us were aware of, and I didn't understand it until later when I began to, in college, and some through reading. But my personal experiences with school desegregation, that had all that had taken shape in me, and this was not a path that I was on individually and personally and uniquely. It was happening, in a lot of other places. If you go back and you look at the Southern whites who joined SNCC and so forth during the Civil Rights Movement, and who worked for voting rights and for change. These were not all these whites in these movements were from the North who'd come down to help save the South.
Right.
This was a change that was beginning to happen in my growing up years, even though I was not really yet aware of it. My own evolution out of the segregationist background that I came from, there was, as I've explained, that even though I was not understanding of it yet, there was that observation I had of the interactions with my grandparents, white-black interactions and circumstances that was going on. And things were changing. I mean, in 1964, we got the Accommodations Act, so you no longer could legally keep blacks out of hotels and restaurants and so forth. And then you got the Voting Rights Act, and then you got the right of women, both black and white, to serve on juries in '67. All this change is occurring. Now, was I paying close attention? Was this a matter of discussion? No, not really. I mean, I was playing baseball. I was going to school. I was playing football. I was doing what you do. When you're a young person, a student, working. As soon as I got to Lafayette, when I was 13, I got my first job working in a grocery store, and then when I was 15, when I was 14, I got a motor scooter, and then I had a morning paper route. I delivered the Montgomery Advertiser in Lafayette, in the morning before school, and so forth. So I was doing things, but was I paying much attention to this change? Not yet. Mm-hmm. It hadn't yet come to me. Mm-hmm. And then as I was, by the time when I was about 17, and by now I was back in school. I had become a high school dropout for a while, but by now I was back in school, and I was becoming I was in a bigger school, and I had friends, and they were of different social and cultural, economic backgrounds, all still segregationist and all still separate and still racist, but different in some ways. But anyway, I had joined the church. I got baptized in the Southern Baptist Church. I had what I thought at the time was a religious conversion, and I, later understand, I thought it was a big mystical moment, and I later came to understand that I had an emotional, peer pressure driven, reaction, and had joined the church. But they gave me, in the little country church I was going to at that time, small Southern Baptist church, so when you get baptized, they give you a Bible. Mm-hmm. Well, I decided to read the damn thing. So, I read the whole thing. A lot of it I didn't, really understand. I skipped over, a lot of parts, the begats and one thing and another. But, I did take it in. And one of the things I realized was that what was actually in the book and what was being said in the pulpit and demonstrated in the church were two very different things. And at the age of about 17, I couldn't reconcile those two separate things. And the Bible drove me out of the Southern Baptist Church, the white Southern Baptist Church. I never went back. Ironically, I went to a Baptist school, a Baptist college, Samford University, Birmingham, conservative, racist place, where I actually learned history and so forth that helped me to understand how wrong most of what I'd been taught was. But the irreconcilability, if that's a word, the inability to reconcile the practices of the white Southern church and the Christian religion as in the King James Bible, that was another step on the evolution out of racism, if that makes any sense.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Before we move on to talking about college, you did mention that you were 17, I believe you said, when the schools were finally segregated years after Brown v. Board. Integrated,
Right.
excuse me. And so you had the experience of being a student in a school that went through integration.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about, what that was like? How did the student body react? What were the, what was the attitude and the mandate of the teachers?
Right. So it's interesting that we're having this conversation here in the Middle District of Alabama courtroom, because the merger of the school systems came about because of civil rights lawsuits filed in this courthouse before Judge Frank Johnson. And interestingly, the prevailing lawsuit filed in Alabama was filed by Fred Gray, whose biography you and I published. And so, long period of nothing happening after Brown v. Board, except for the massive resistance of Southern whites to that Supreme Court ruling. And in the by the time I was in the 10th grade at Lafayette High School, the courts had they had worked out freedom of choice. They called it freedom of choice, and under that freedom of choice, you could choose whether it was a black school and a white school. You could choose which school you were going to go to, and no whites chose to go to the black schools, but some blacks, a few, did choose to go to the white schools. And so I think the year I was a 10th grader, we had at Lafayette High School, we had the first handful of black students who came from, they'd been going to the Chambers County training school, and training schools exist all across Alabama. They're the black schools, and they're called that because it was the white ethos of public education was that, okay, well, we got to educate blacks, so we're going to train them to be good workers and so forth in these training schools. Well, so some students, a handful, came to Lafayette High School, and we had our first African-American teachers that came, again, just a couple, to Lafayette High School. These students were ostracized, harassed, beat up, just abused, on a regular basis. Were they educated? Yes. Did they graduate? Yes. But the experience was not, pleasant at all for them. And the white students their reactions ranged from, some tolerance to outright, hostility. And that was, the way that worked.
And the teachers
And
and administration, they were complicit in this? Or?
They were, the teachers probably were as resistant in some ways as anybody else. Some were not. I mean, they were good teachers at Lafayette High School, and some were people, there's one I know to this day, Louise Cox, who, is one of the most interesting and progressive, people I know. So her attitude would have been welcoming and so forth, and others would have been just sort of acquiescent. And polite. None of the teachers that I recall were overtly antagonistic or mean in the common sense of that word. But it was so it was part of the what became the evolution of the mergers. And then by 1969, the year I was entering as a senior in high school that year, the whites in Alabama had basically run out of courts. There were no other places they could appeal to. The rulings had all gone against them. Finally, the schools had to merge. And so that did happen. And whereas my class, senior class, would have been about 35 people, 35 whites in my senior class at Lafayette High School. Now it had about 75 people in it, and about slightly more than half were blacks who had come from the Chambers County Training School. And that was our experience with desegregation. And I will have to say it was a mostly trouble-free and peaceful and even hopeful experience. I felt that to the extent that I knew to think about it, in abstract ways, I was, I guess I was aware of what it meant and was fine with that. And again, as I described earlier, I already had begun my march out of the cultural racism that had been my experience up to that point. And now, suddenly, here I was with the black classmates, people like, Rudolph Copeland and Ruby Nell Whitlow and Jimmy Askew and Jacqueline Slaughter are some of the names that I remember. And they were excellent, people and students and friends and athletes, and we all got along pretty well, as I recall. Now, we still had culturally segregation, and years later, a decade later, in fact, I actually interviewed Rudolph Copeland about this for an article that I wrote about the two school systems in Lafayette and their mergers. I wrote about that in the Southern Exposure magazine, and I actually went and found and interviewed Rudolph Copeland, and he said that, we didn't have a prom that year either, did we? And I said, well, actually, Rudy, we did have one. You just weren't invited because the white students had, gotten together and, had their own. Since the school prom was now, you couldn't have a school prom and have it be segregated. So the white students had just gone outside the school system and had their own, sort of prom.
So there was no prom at all at the school?
No prom at the school, but the white students, of which I was one, we had a prom. And I told Rudy, I said, well, actually we had one, Rudy, but you weren't invited. And he said, well, there you go. Right. He was at that point a lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and I've lost track of Rudy, but he was a really, really fine, human being and a good student. So the merger then happened, but what also happened was that some whites in town didn't agree with that. They didn't want it, and so they popped up suddenly with a private academy that was to be the purpose of it was to provide a higher level of education than you could get at the public school, and so forth. And it had nothing to do with segregation. It wasn't what it's about. But the school, they named the school Chambers Academy, and They chose as their school colors gray. Their school flag was the Confederate battle flag. The school song was Dixie. The school nickname was the Rebels. I mean, it couldn't have been much clearer. And so that school started the same year that integration had to occur and did. And the first year they had about 8 students. The next year they had 30, 40. After the year after that, they had twice that many, and within 3 or 4 years, basically almost all the white students who at Lafayette High School had fled to Chambers Academy, which still exists. And meanwhile, Lafayette High School had become almost all black, and so you had a black black public school at that point, almost all black, and you had an all-white private school. Now, I still get the Lafayette Sun, the weekly newspaper from my hometown, and about within the past decade, I was opened up the Lafayette Sun, and here's the Chambers Academy basketball team, and I damn near fell out of my chair. Here are some black kids at the Chambers, on the Chambers Academy basketball team. So, the school is at least it's at least tokenly integrated at this point. So why they still have it, I don't know. It makes no sense. I mean, this town is not big enough to have one really good high school, let alone 2, and the resources and the diversion of resources makes no common sense. Okay, I get it that Chambers Academy at this point, they're 50 years old now, and they have a campus, they've got investment of money, they've got alumni, they have tradition. I get all that, and yet for Chambers County, Alabama, and Lafayette, Alabama, it makes no sense in any kind of way to have these 2 schools. There's no answer to it, and I don't live there. I don't have a dog, as they say, in that fight anymore, except interest, which I do have. And interestingly, the case that was filed in the 1960s by Fred Gray, and which was consolidated into one case by Judge Frank Johnson, that case is still going on. They're still arguing about it. And in fact, this next year, they are about to close Lafayette High School, and they are consolidating. They're building a consolidated high school down in the valley, which is a travesty that they're doing it, but they're doing it. And this Middle District of Alabama, has now approved that, and it said it's okay. I disagree, but I'm not on the court. So.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, let's get you to college. Okay. You decided you were going to college, and you mentioned earlier that you enrolled at Samford University in Birmingham. Okay, so tell us how you came to select Samford, and what was your declared major to start, and then, let's fast forward and get us into, your experiences there.
Okay, I'll be quick through this. So I didn't have a lot of experience in college. There had been very few members of my family. I had 2 cousins who had been to college, but they were older than me, and none of my aunts and uncles on either side of the family had been to college. I had 2 cousins who were older than me who had been to college, but I didn't, really have I had no consultation or guidance or whatever. So I had narrowed my school choices down to 3. University of Michigan, to which I had a scholarship, MIT, to which I had a scholarship, and Samford, to which I had a scholarship. And I had Sanford was not that far away. It's just 120 miles up the road in Birmingham. And Michigan and MIT were both worlds away. And I had friends who were going to Sanford, so I said, okay, I'll go there. So I went there. And I don't regret going there. Sanford was at that time, barely integrated itself. Ironically, though I was not on any of the Sanford sports teams, I'd played 3 sports in, high school, and, I was reasonably athletic. And I lived in my freshman year, I lived in the athletic dorm, and I had a black roommate. And I don't know how I came to be the one, white person there. I had a black roommate. I have no idea about that. But it was fine. Walter and I got along just fine and liked each other. And I only lived in the dorm 1 year because I got married between my freshman and sophomore years, and after that I didn't live in the dorm again. But so I was at the school, and it was a conservative institution, again a Southern Baptist institution, which I had left by that point, the Southern Baptist Church, but I was there in that school. And you had to take some religion courses, and interestingly, I thought, in retrospect, I think that the Southern Baptist professors of religion were among the most enlightened and liberal professors on the campus. And I liked them all. And we had spirited discussions about, biblical doctrine and history and one thing and another, and it was very engaging, quite different from what I had experienced growing up in the rural Southern Baptist Church. And when I went to Sanford, I went up there thinking I would become a lawyer, and so I was, kind of a pre-law curriculum. But I got really interested in English and literature, and I really got interested in history. And one of my history professors was Wayne Flint, who would later leave Sanford. He was a graduate of Howard College, later Sanford University himself. And he taught there after he got his PhD. He taught history there for a few years before going to Alabama. He went to Auburn University. And, I think most people would probably say, not only a great public citizen of Alabama, but, one of its most distinguished historians. So he taught courses on the origins of the New South, using C. Van Woodward's books, I should say. And he proceeded to, as good professors do, he proceeded to engage you, and he proceeded to unlearn for me the stuff that I had thought I had understood about Southern history and Alabama history and culture. And that led then to my becoming involved with the student newspaper, and eventually becoming the editor of the student newspaper, the Sanford Crimson. And I'll keep this real short, but as a student newspaper, we were covering stuff on campus. None of it was profane, out of bounds. We were basically student journalists. We were taking journalism courses. We were trying to practice what we were being taught, and so we had a student newspaper. And the university, meanwhile, was engaged in a controversial land development deal that had the local community all up in arms. And we thought we were doing what student journalists are supposed to do. We were reporting on this to the students in the student newspaper. And we were told by the president of the university that we could not do that because we were actually not running a student newspaper. We were running a house organ of Samford University, and we could print in the paper on this topic a press release that they would give us. And so the entire staff, with the exception of one freshman student whose father was a prominent Baptist minister, the entire staff resigned, and we said, okay, we'll fix this. We'll start our own independent student newspaper that is not using any university funds, and therefore we will solve this problem for you. And we did. We more or less got expelled for our troubles. Not directly expelled, because we appealed to two ACLU lawyers in Birmingham named Bill Dawson and Bill Pugh, and they represented us in the hearings before the Samford trustee board. And Samford decided that they couldn't expel us exactly, but what they did was take away our scholarship money. So when I went to register for my classes at the beginning of my senior year, I discovered that I owed money that I didn't have because I no longer had any scholarship. So it effectively removed me from school, and I went to work for the Birmingham News, where I had interned the previous summer anyway, and then after we had resigned from the student newspaper, which was a work study job, and I needed the money from the work study job because I was married. I had I had to support myself, and so. I was working nights for the Birmingham News as a general assignment reporter and loving it. It was a lot of fun and rewarding. And I did that for another year, almost a year. And then I, in Birmingham, started my own community newspaper. It was sort of a city paper, arts and entertainment, kind of a newspaper. And I had that for about 15 months, and again, enjoying it greatly.
Okay, well, let me interrupt and
Okay.
let's establish this is when you prematurely left Samford
Right.
because you were expelled or effectively expelled.
Effectively expelled.
Right. And you went as a reporter to the Birmingham News. So
Right.
that was probably a good learning experience for you. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you haven't graduated, but you're now working for the Birmingham News. When was that?
Okay, so I interned at the News in the summer of '72, and then in the fall of '72, spring of '73, I would have been working part-time at the News, and then shortly after that, full-time at the News. And then by mid-1974, I decided to leave the News and start this start this community weekly newspaper. Because it was fun, it was entrepreneurial, and seemed like a neat thing to do. It was the first of the quote city papers in Birmingham at that
But you
time.
were then launched into a journalism career,
That's right.
right? Had you even decided you were going to be a journalist? Was that in your mind?
I
At the
had.
time you went to the student newspaper, the Crimson, the first student newspaper.
Right.
Okay, so you're launched into journalism, and what you're covering as a reporter, are you becoming more civically engaged? I mean, how would you describe your progress, your personal growth when you were at the News?
Yeah.
Did it impact on it at all?
Yes. Discovering the student newspaper when I really was a freshman at Samford, and then starting doing a little work, and then moving up to be an assistant editor and then editor. and taking some journalism courses. If I had it to do over again, I'd take very few journalism courses. I'd take economics and history and those things. But still, I liked journalism. I liked it both as a student and then as a professional. Being a journalist is great. You get to go out, you get to talk to people, you get to discover stories, you get to try to explain those. If you like to write, which I did, and the lack of a college education in that period, it was no hindrance. You can either write or you can't. And if you're the readers who are reading your stories, they don't know whether you got a degree or 4 degrees or no degree. They just know what you've written, and your editors are the same way. So I never found it to be a hindrance not to have an actual college degree. And I eventually did get one. It took, I started in the fall of 1970, and I finally graduated in the spring of 2011. So I did eventually go back to school and graduate, but all those years in between, it never was a hindrance to me. But I was a journalist and intended to do journalism. And when I finally closed my weekly paper, because I thought that it was a lot of work, hard work. I worked very hard for 15 months, and the paper was growing and getting a reputation, and I thought we were doing well and making progress. We're making progress in every way except from a business standpoint. We didn't know squat about business. We could find stories, we could write about them, we learned how to lay it out, put it together, make it look decent. But we just never could handle the financial end of it. I had a patron who underwrote it, a great man named Joe Simpson, who was a mentor and friend until he died. And he was wealthy, and he would have been willing to continue subsidizing our paper. But it got to the point that I finally said to him, I said, Joe, look, we're just taking your money and we're not getting it better. And he said, oh, if I don't give it to you, Virginia, his wife, she'll give it to the ballet. You may as well have it. But even so, I said, well, we're just going to call it quits and have had a good run. So we did that, and then I set out to find another job, and Montgomery was where I landed. And so I worked at the Alabama Journal as a reporter for 2 years, almost 2 years, before making a career switch and going to work at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, I want to say about journalism that when you start out and you're a cub reporter, you're covering whatever they tell you to cover. You're covering the Kiwanis Club meeting where somebody's speaking. You're covering the local charity thing. They send you over to interview Lawrence Welk before he does his show at the Birmingham Civic Center. General stuff. But the longer you do it and the better you get established at it, the more you start gravitating to writing about education, politics, social welfare, criminal justice, all of those things. And so I was doing that increasingly at the Birmingham News, and when I started my own little paper, even though we started out being a paper that covered arts and entertainment and music and the local scene, we were also increasingly writing about the community, and we had adopted, there was a pretty large housing project pretty near our office in downtown Birmingham, and so we started actually covering that housing project, giving them their own page in the paper. First time many of these people had ever seen their names, in print or had any attention paid to their issues. So you're writing about these things and you're doing that. And then when I came to Montgomery, first I covered the outlying counties, Elmore and Autauga, and so I was covering school boards and county commissions and city councils and sheriff's departments and police departments and those kinds of things. And then I got promoted or graduated up to or whatever. I became the City Hall reporter for the Journal. And so I'm covering all that's going on in city government, who's on boards and what the boards are doing, and the agencies and the development of the community development block grant funds are becoming available, and what are they being used for, and how are they being used, and the school situations, and so you are writing about all those topics every single day, and no matter what the story was, if you peel back the layers in Alabama, in Montgomery, it's about race.
Right.
Every single thing. If you if you scratch under the surface, you're gonna find race in there.
Right.
And you're meeting interesting people along the way. I'm in some ways uniquely, I think, fortunate given to be in Montgomery, and for as long as I have been. I've been here now since 74. And I started work at the Journal in November of 1974. And over the years, I have met and worked with and known just about every significant person in the civil rights movement, hierarchy, leadership at that time. Never knew King, of course. He was. I was still in high school when he was assassinated. Obviously didn't know Medgar Evers. Never met Malcolm X. But you run down the list of all the rest: Rosa Parks, Julian Bond, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy, Joseph Lowry, C.T. Vivian. You run down
Nixon.
E.D. Nixon,
Johnny Carr.
Johnny Carr. You run down the list. I've known and had a relationship. Miles Horton at Highlander, Septima Clark in South Carolina. There are all these Arthur Shores in Birmingham, Fred Gray. We mentioned Richard Arrington in Birmingham, Joe Reed. Here in Montgomery. You develop. I've been fortunate to be able to develop a relationship with and get to know these people
Right.
over the course of my career. The Southern Poverty Law Center, after I'd been at the Journal for about almost 2 years, a friend of mine, Penny Weaver, had been the director of the publications program at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And she was married to Kendall Weaver of the Associated Press, and he was being transferred to Mobile to run the Mobile Bureau of the AP. And so they were moving to Mobile, and she just kind of casually asked, said, "Hey, I'm leaving my job over at the law center. You might be interested in applying. I think you'd do that." And I thought about it. At that point, I had probably, I felt that I had gone about as far as I probably could go at the Journal. And my next move would have been to try to go to a bigger paper like the St. Pete Times or the Atlanta Constitution or something like that. I was not foolish enough or naive enough to think about the New York Times or the Washington Post, but you're on a career and you're going to do journalism, and so you got a progression and that you're thinking about. But at any rate, I thought about it, and I wasn't ready to leave Montgomery yet. So the law center was interesting, and all the stuff I'd been writing about and covering was related to, not all, but a lot of it was related to work that the Southern Public Law Center had done.
Right.
And I had covered, I knew those people.
The mission of the Law
Yeah.
Center had, right.
And interestingly, when I was at Samford and was in my fight with the school administration at Samford, the president of the Cumberland Student Bar Association, Cumberland Law School, is at Samford, and the president of that student bar the year this newspaper controversy at Samford came up was a man named John Carroll. And John Carroll and his fellow law students took we student journalists' side in that dispute. And then John graduated from Cumberland. He went to Harvard and did a year of study at Harvard. And then he came to the Southern Public Law Center. And I was still working at the Alabama Journal when he came to the Law Center, but I saw that he had come and, called him up and went to lunch and was, friendly with him, played basketball with him and stuff like that. And so then when Penny planted the seed about applying at the Law Center, not only did I know the Law Center and its work and had written about it, but I knew John Carroll and so forth. So I did make that move and went to went there. John Carroll, by the way, who just died, I was at his funeral service a month or so ago, and he eventually left the Law Center, became a law professor at Mercer, and then he became a magistrate judge in this very courthouse, and was a distinguished magistrate judge. And then he became the dean of Samford, of Cumberland Law School at Samford. So sort of full circle in how that worked.
Right.
But then I was at the Southern Public Law Center, and I'd started out at Samford thinking I'd become a lawyer. I didn't, but now I was in this public interest law firm that did all this interesting and significant work. And I was around all these lawyers, and I was not only doing the publications that the center issued, but I was working for the lawyers, assisting them on cases, doing research, doing some editing of materials they produced. Not legal editing, because I had no law training, but just editing things and doing interviewing witnesses and doing jury research prior to doing voir dire and cases, criminal and civil. And it was a good, exciting.
A good education.
Good education, exciting time, great colleagues. Really enjoyed it and did good work, I think. Did good work. And that was sort of the transition to away from journalism, which I would return to in the future, but at that particular point, I had moved away from journalism.
So you were 2 years at the Law Center, correct? More or less?
About 2 years,
right. And then you chose to leave the Law Center and do what? Where did you go from there?
Yeah, I think I decided to have my midlife crisis early and get it out of the way.
Okay.
Let's see, in 78, I would have been 27.
You were precocious.
I would have been 27 in 78.
Right.
And so in 1 week in 1978, I got divorced and changed jobs and moved to a new state. I didn't actually change jobs so much as took a leave of absence from the Law Center, and I went to work on the staff of the Institute for Southern Studies in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which published the magazine Southern Exposure, which I had written for. And they were starting a new magazine, trying to start a new magazine. It didn't ultimately succeed, partly my fault probably. But anyway, I went there to start to edit that new publication they were trying to get started. I remained on the connected to the Law Center. I had not actually quit I had just taken a leave of absence. And so I had been appointed to the board of the law center. And so even though I was in North Carolina for a while, I was still connected to the law center. And then I helped start a weekly newspaper in North Georgia for a year, and was briefly managing editor of a daily newspaper in Thomasville, Georgia, for not very long, just a few months. And at that point, I was asked to come back to the law center and develop a idea that Morris Dees had come up with for something to be called Klan Watch, which was an anti-Ku Klux Klan project.
Okay.
And, in some ways you could say I was perfect for that job because I understood these Klans people because they were I'd come out of the same background they had. And again, I make the distinction between cultural racist, which some of these Klansmen were, and philosophical, intellectual racist, which some of them also were. But I understood them pretty well. And I understood the mission that we were doing with the Klan Watch project, which arose out of the fact that the Ku Klux Klan, went through several cycles, ebb and fall, a rise and ebb, a rise and fall. Since its founding after the Civil War, it had gone through these periods. And at the end of the 60s, as the 60s were coming to a close, the Klan had been beaten back by law enforcement, FBI, local jurisdictions. Some of the leadership was in prison and so forth, and the numbers had declined quite a bit. Then in the mid-1970s, David Duke arose in Louisiana, a neo-Nazi Klansman. He popularized the notion of a new Klan, that they would wear. They didn't all have to wear sheets. They could wear regular clothes and whatever, and they would be not against blacks, but they would be for white rights, which now at this point they claimed were being, they were the ones being discriminated against. So he was photogenic and telegenic and a publicity, very adept at getting publicity, and so the resurgence of the Klan started, and by 1978, 79, and there was a labor dispute over in North Mississippi that has spilled over into Northwest Alabama. And the Klan had begun recruiting, holding public rallies, and so forth in ways that they had not really done since the 1920s, really. And there was a Klan rally in Decatur, Alabama in late 1978, I think it was. It had 12,000 people at it, a Ku Klux Klan rally, 1978, 12,000 people. And then the Ku Klux Klan attacked a civil rights march in Decatur, Alabama in May of 1979 that was led by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Ku Klux Klan, about 125 members, wearing robes and carrying sticks and pipes and tree limbs and whatever, had attacked in broad daylight this well-publicized march. And there was some firing of guns and one thing and another, and this black guy, as a Klansman was advancing on him. The black guy was not even a part of the march. He just was a bystander. But he was a Klansman was advancing on him with a upraised tree limb, and the black guy shot him. Didn't kill him, but he shot him. And that black guy was arrested, and the Southern Poverty Law Center represented him. And that led to an awareness of the extent of this resurgence of the Klan and what it represented. And so Morris, the Law Center and John Carroll and Morris Dees represented the defendant Curtis Robinson in that case, and then they filed a civil lawsuit against the Klan group and it attacked him. And all of that led to Morris's notion, let's start the Klan Watch Project, which was not only consistent with Morris's legal philosophy, but it was also consistent with his genius for raising money for the Law Center through direct mail at that time. A lot of issues that Law Center had done were hard to raise money on. Death penalty cases, serious cases, but hard to raise money on them. Run-of-the-mill poverty kind of issues, hard to raise money on those. Gun control, couldn't raise any money on that. But the Klan issue, all of a sudden, when they started sending out appeals on that, that raised a lot of money. And so Morris's notion was about the project was both was consistent with both sides of his work, which was a fine legal mind, but also a fundraising genius. And he was able, to do that. So he conceived the Klan Watch Project, and then I was asked to leave my newspaper job and Georgia, which I was ready to do anyway because I could not agree with the publisher over there on what day of the week it was, let alone what we were going to put in the paper. That may say more about me than it does about him, but be that as it may. So they asked me to come back and implement Morris's idea, and I did that. And so by the late
as its director, correct?
As the founding director of the Klan Watch Project. So by late 1980, early 1981, I had moved back to Montgomery, and was at the Law Center, and we were the project had multiple missions. One, we were going to do public education. We're going to write publications and publicize this resurgence of the Klan, what they really were doing, because they claimed that they were different from the past Klans, but they were not. They were still attacking people and harassing people, interracial couples getting beat up, people getting shot, people firing into people's houses being fired into, all this kind of stuff, and all that was going on. So there was the public education aspect. There was low-level monitoring and surveillance. We weren't infiltrating the Klan. We were not an undercover operation, but we monitored all their publications, listened to their, interviews and so forth when they'd have them. Occasionally would go to their rallies, public rallies, and observe and so forth, all of which was in furtherance of the other work, the education work, and the third component was the litigation, of which the Klan Watch Project was supporting that, and that we were providing the research and often the investigation of the cases that the center's lawyers would file. And they were very successful at it, Morris and the other lawyers. Morris is not a book lawyer. He's got a good legal mind and he's great before a jury and all those things, but he knew how to surround himself with Harvard and Yale, graduated law school attorneys who had clerked for federal judges and one thing or another. And so they would have these ideas about how to handle these cases so that you're not just suing a couple of Klansmen who beat up a black guy. You sue the corporate Klan organization. And so they were successful in 3 or 4 big cases like that, put 3 or 4 of these groups, out of business. Meanwhile, we're publishing newsletters for police departments, telling them, gosh, here's what's going on. Pay attention to it because what these people are doing, you may not be noticing it, but it's illegal. And if you suddenly have Klan flyers being put out all over town this week, you can bet that in the weeks to come, you're going to have harassment, you're going to have confrontation, and so forth. That's beginning to take an effect. We would do the same thing with newsletters aimed at the general public. We would do it for teachers. We produced a manual, what to do when the Klan comes to town. We produced a documentary film about the Klan that got nominated for an Oscar. That was widely used to, again, help raise the awareness. And it had a positive effect. Within a few years, the Klan membership, the resurgence, was dropping, and it had gone back down within a few years back to what it had been before David Duke had started his leadership of this so-called new Klan. The project was supposed to only be for about a 3-year project, but toward the end of the project, we had the misfortune that the Klan some members of one of the Klan factions firebombed our offices. That led to, a whole new legal and investigatory aspect of what we were doing. And on the fundraising side, it brought in even more money. I mean, the ashes had not even cooled before, Horace and his helpers had succeeded in brilliantly putting out mails about that, enough such that we were able to build a new building downtown, a nice new office building. And then, of course, that continued over the years, and they had another big new office building and so forth. But all of that work was going on, and it was all somewhat around the same issues that I had been wrestling with, as I was trying to escape from my past in Alabama and trying to help in some little way to move Alabama toward being a more just and better and more a fairer place for people to live.
Right.
All those components were in there, and they continue to be in there at the Law Center as well.
Well, digress a little bit, if you would. I mean, you were there, your tenure at the Law Center that second time was 5 or 6 years, am I correct? And
yeah.
But during that time was a very fertile period for you because you were doing a number of things in the local community, civically. I mean, talk about, for example, the Todd Rowe incident, which, and what that sparked, what you did, and talk to us a little bit about the Friendly Supper Club and Leadership Montgomery and various other activities of yours during that period.
Oh, okay. Briefly, the Todd Road case in 1983, I guess it was in a way symptomatic of the lingering problems of racism that was still out there that were, it showed why the work that journalists and that lawyers, why the criminal justice and the civil justice system, the courts, all of their work was important because the root issues, though they'd been so much change and progress. I mean, people say, that, well, what progress did you make? And my God, the difference between the world that I knew growing up, the total segregation and so forth, the world that I was born into and was raised in, the change was profound. I mean, you know, it's everywhere in education and politics and you know, in residential, you know, all these court cases and struggles, and the civil rights struggles, the court cases had been fought and for the most part won, and great progress, you know, had been made. And yet the root causes were still out there. The root fundamentals of racist culture and often behavior were still out there. The Todd Road case exemplified or brought into highlight in some ways some of the problems, because here you had a case where a group of mourners, had a group of people from Detroit, Michigan, family members of whose family members were still had family members here in Montgomery, and a member of that family had died, and some of these mourners had come to Montgomery for a wake and a funeral. And late at night, two undercover cops in Montgomery, white cops, are patrolling a black neighborhood, and they see all these big cars with Michigan license plates around this modest little house, and they put two and two together and come up with seven and conclude that some drug deal must be going down. And so they burst into this house, and that's full of African American people who are in there, gathered for this wake, and the two white cops are overpowered, and you know, a shot is fired or whatever. There's fighting going on, and the white cops are overpowered. And what do the blacks in the house do? They call the cops. They call the police, because they didn't know who these people were that had burst in on them. They were in plain clothes and so forth. Anyway, it led, and meanwhile, then in the middle of the night, the mayor of Montgomery, himself a notorious racist, I shall say, and the police chief at the time, they have a press conference in which they, you know, have arrested all these mourners inside this house, and they have a press conference in which they describe them as being animals and, you know, thugs and one thing and another. And it happened on a place, the name of the street was called Todd Road, and so it has become known as the Todd Road incident, and it pretty quickly became that. And it polarized the black and white community at that time. And the polarization was not only it was historical, and it was also because of the way it had been handled by the mayor and the police chief, which were themselves examples of institutional and systemic racism that was still out there. Polarized the black community and polarized the whole community, polarized it black-white, the community. Meanwhile, an enterprising reporter here in Montgomery named Alvin Ben, who just died, he worked for the local paper. He got on he took a plane, went to Detroit, and he interviewed people who knew these thugs and animals, and turned out they're all upstanding citizens of Detroit. And he came back and wrote about this, and gradually, you know, things and began to change, and several incidents came, several lasting things happened as a result of that. One was an organization called Leadership Montgomery, which was started by three white businessmen and the black lawyer Solomon C. The businessman Lenny Crane, George Goodwin, Mike Jenkins, and Solomon C. They started this group called Leadership Montgomery that was meant to take young adults in the Montgomery community and educate them, introduce them to each other and educate them about local issues. There are leadership programs in lots of cities. Montgomery's was copied from those other cities. Its focus on race and racial issues, at least in the beginning, was perhaps unique in the way they did that. But anyway, that started as a result of the Todd Road case. Another organization called One Montgomery, which was a biracial or interracial breakfast group that met every week. It met and people sat down and broke bread and had a speaker, had a little program, and so forth, and it lasts to this day. And then an outlier one called the Friendly Supper Club sprang up in the same time period. And the Friendly Supper Club was an experiment. It was started anonymously, and it simply posited that, hey, come to the Friendly Supper Club and just talk. You got no program, you got no speakers, you just have conversation, you meet people, and the only rules are that you invite a guest of a different race than your own, and everybody pays for their own meal. And it happened, it sprang up at a time in the middle of all this when the community tension was high, and it had a little bit of novelty to it in that it was anonymous, and it remains anonymous to this day. Who the founders of the Friendly Supper Club were. That organization lasted until the pandemic hit, and then the pandemic closed it down. I assume it closed down for a time, and well, in fact, I know it closed down One Montgomery. They started doing Zoom meetings. I think they've now resumed in-person meetings. But the Friendly Supper Club is I think basically done at this point. But it served a very interesting role in that it just every week and every month, I should say, it would bring together sometimes 80 people who just showed up. And they would be of all ages, and initially it was just black and white, but then it got to be Hispanic and Asian and as well. And people came and they just talked.
But to clarify, you were involved in these organizations either participating or to help launch these organizations in some kind of way. You were pretty busy during this time. You were at the Law Center and doing these things in your downtime, your private life. You haven't mentioned the Montgomery Improvement Association, so that played an important role, if I'm correct, in your adult life, and you had a long-term involvement with the MIA. And friendships grew out of the MIA. So tell us a little bit about that group.
Yeah. Well, the Montgomery Improvement Association, of course, is the organization that was started in 1955 to advance the Montgomery bus boycott. The circumstances of the time, the NAACP was under attack by the racist state officials in Alabama. And so it was felt by the leaders of the bus boycott that they needed an organization, a new organization to run it, and they organized the Montgomery Improvement Association. And of course, Martin Luther King was the first president, Ralph Abernathy was the second president, Attorney Solomon C., his father, the Reverend Solomon C., The Reverend pronounced his name Say. He said, I can say better than I can see. But his son, the lawyer, the white branch and some of the black branches of the C family pronounced it C, and so he did. But at any rate, the Reverend Say, who was had been a mentor to both Fred Gray and Martin Luther King, he was also a president, and eventually, I think Mrs. Johnny Carr became president of the group. And Mrs. Carr was childhood friends with Rosa Parks, and she remained friends with her as long as they both lived. And it's through, I had covered, as a newspaper reporter, I had covered the Montgomery Improvement Association, which still existed. And I had met Mrs. Carr, and I had met Mrs. Parks, and I had met Mrs. Virginia Durr. The use of the term of the word Mrs. deserves a little elaboration, because I mentioned that one of the things about Jim Crow segregation was that the social the way whites would not refer to adult blacks by honorifics, Mr., Mrs., etc. But among some whites, and Mrs. Virginia Durr was one of them. Virginia Durr, fascinating woman, married to Clifford Durr, and played key roles in the civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s. She was the sister-in-law of Hugo Black, Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black. And at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, and before the Montgomery bus boycott, she had known Rosa Parks both as a she first had known her as a seamstress. She hired her to sew dresses for her 4 daughters. Ms. Durr hired Mrs. Parks to sew dresses for her 4 daughters. And then, of course, she and her husband Clifford, they had underwritten Mrs. Parks going in the summer of 1955 to the Highlander Folk Center, interracial labor and civil rights organization, and based in Tennessee. And they had underwritten Ms. Parks going there and spending some time there, which was helped her in her resolve and in her later work. And so Mrs. Virginia Durr and Mrs. Rosa Parks, they were friends and remained, friends. And I don't, I never knew what Mrs. I don't know exactly what Mrs. Durr and Mrs. Parks and Mrs. Carr called each other when it's just them sitting around. But in public, they, even though they were at this point lifelong friends, they always referred to each other as, Mrs. Parks and Mrs. Durr and Mrs. Carr. And, it was a showing of respect that was, not common. It's not that it was totally unique, but it was not common in the white racist culture. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I had covered these women as a reporter. I had covered them at meetings of the Montgomery Improvement Association and other things. And then I had continued to know Mrs. Carr and Mrs. Durr. Mrs. Parks, I knew slightly because she was, even when I would be covering her, she didn't live here. She lived in Detroit. but she would be back to visit fairly often and come back to meetings and conferences and things. She'd stay with Mrs. Carr and so forth. And so I'd gotten to know increasingly Mrs. Carr. And at some point, she invited me to be a member of the board of directors of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And as far as I know, Bob Gretz, the Reverend Bob Gretz, the late Reverend Bob Gretz, who was in 1955 the white minister of a black Lutheran congregation in West Montgomery, just down the street from where Mrs. Parks lived. And he had been the only white Montgomery minister who was supportive of the Montgomery bus boycott. And he and his wife Jeannie lived in the parsonage of this black Lutheran church, Trinity Lutheran Church, over in West Montgomery, in the middle of a black neighborhood. Here was this white family and about 5 white children living in this neighborhood. And he then had been the only white on the original board of directors of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And then Mrs. Carr invited me to be on the board. And as far as I know, Gretz and I are the only whites that ever served on the board. And I was on the MIA board for about 30 years. It's not that we did a whole lot. But you know, we had meetings and we talked about issues and we kind of kept the name alive and so forth. And I enjoyed the associations and relationships, you know, that were on that. And I became Mrs. Carr's sort of a social secretary because she'd have some document or statement she wanted to make, and she'd bring over her, you know, handwritten notes and ask me to dress it up and put it in a form that could be made into a press release or a handout or something like that. And so I would do that for her. I got to ride. I and other members of the MIA board got in one of these stretch limo things and drove over to Atlanta and attended Coretta King's funeral, which was a powerful experience. Funeral lasted 6.5 hours. I think I may be the only person in the audience that didn't speak. No, I'm joking about that, but I mean they had a long line of speakers. Everybody spoke, and it was a big, you know, a big thing. But that was a part of the MIA kind of experience. So I have been fortunate to have grown up, you know, a white racist in Alabama, escape from that, and then have become an adult and lived these many years here with quite, you know, easily and firmly planted kind of in both communities. And I've been happy with these relationships and continue to work as much as possible with people. You know, you're trying as best you can to work toward Martin Luther King's beloved community.
Right, right. Well, you continued in that capacity. You continued in establishing your own publishing company, right? And, through which you did some magazine work, but also really began in earnest to publish books. I guess you published the stories of people who were trying to make change happen. You looked for those stories. Tell us about your, you know, the evolution into publishing per se after you left. You published magazines as well. Tell us a little bit about that. But for the next 20 years, really, until recent times, you've been engaged in managing in creating and managing a book publishing company, and then another with myself. So tell us about how you morphed from that role at the center into the role you played at Black Belt Press.
Okay. One thing I'd start by saying is that I feel extremely lucky to, I've never actually had a job, because everything I've done, I would have gladly done for free, or would even have paid to get to do it, because it's been interesting and rewarding. The business about getting, would have done it for free is a good thing, because a lot of times I was doing it for free because the pay and most of what I've done has not been immense, but it's been very satisfying. And in my own mind, I don't make a whole lot of distinction between the different parts, because I feel like that all the work is oriented around those goals of explaining history, telling stories, trying to increase understanding of what our history is and what our issues are, have been and are, and will be going forward, and of the people who've engaged in this work across all ages and races. So in that respect, I feel blessed. My departure from the Law Center in '86 was at a time of change within the center. The Klan work, even though I was the director of the project, I felt it was meant to be a shorter project to start with. Certainly by the '86, I felt that we had done most of what we were trying to do, and the right wing to continue focusing on the Klan, and was I thought kind of misdirected and in some ways short-sighted, because the Klan numbers had fallen back into very small numbers nationwide of organized Klansmen. And the intellectual part of the Klan movement, that part had morphed into the neo-Nazi, Aryan nations, general, white supremacist, Christian nationalism, all those aspects that bedevil us to this moment, and we still haven't figured out, what to do about it. We work against it, but we haven't figured out how to help people, enough people out of it. So when I left the Law Center, it was partly to get back to publishing and writing and editing more in general. And I did that by starting a magazine here in Montgomery with my ex-wife, Hilda. We started a city magazine, Montgomery Magazine, and then pretty soon after that, I started doing significant amounts of time and work for the Southern Regional Council in Atlanta, and the Center for Democratic Renewal in Atlanta, and the Alabama Historical Commission, groups like that, publications work, newsletters, etc. And then I, quite almost by accident, published a book, The Alabama Angels, by the folk artist Mary Barwick. And that book, did quite well, astonishingly well, actually. So anybody who knows about book publishing, when I say that I sold 30,000 copies of the book locally, they are kind of astounded, as they should be. And then I sold the rights to it to Ballantine, which is a division of Random House, and they went on to sell 250 million copies. I should have just stopped there, but I kept I kept publishing books, and that led to a book publishing company called Black Belt Press. And that is how I got to meet you, which is the greatest success. But the role of Black Belt was to put into book form significant stories about people who, in the post-World War II era, were engaged in contending with or creating change that had come to the region. So essentially, you're talking about the civil rights movement. We've always published some books on Reconstruction history, slavery history, because you can't get at the civil rights movement without going through those two things. And so over the years, it developed into a pretty large number of books by and about significant people who were engaged in these struggles, not just in Alabama,
Right.
but
Right.
across the South. I mentioned earlier that we had published the biography of Fred Gray. We published the biography of Hal Heflin. We published a fine biography of Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, biography of Judge Frank Johnson, many books like that. And you get a reputation for doing that, and more people come, and so you get to continue doing them. In recent years, we did, in the new company, because you and I, after Black Belt Press, which had about a 10-year run, you and I started New South Books, and we continue to publish the same kind of books on the same sorts of themes. Again, these are not all Southern stories, and they're not all, even the ones in the South, are not all about Alabama. And in recent years, for example, we published C.T. Vivian's memoir. We published a coffee table kind of picture biography of Andy Young. We have a children's book about Johnny Carr. So all of this work was really just an extension of what I had done in journalism and what I had done at the Southern Poverty Law Center, aimed sort of at the same goals and with, I think, somewhat similar audiences and missions. And it's satisfying, and it's creative work, and you get to be immersed in all these stories, and you get to learn from them, and then you get to share them with other people. And newspaper articles are great. I love newspapering. I love magazine work. But books have a permanence, and they continue to live. And together we've published 900, 1,000 books. I don't know. I jokingly tell people 25 or 30 of them are pretty damn good books, and they will continue to live, and they will be in people's libraries and in and so forth for years to come. And that's an accomplishment for us as their publishers, but the accomplishment really is for the people who wrote them and for the people whose stories that these authors are telling.
And if these books have helped foster discussion on these important issues, if they, in a way, were spark change, then even better, right?
That's right. That's the
That's
goal.
the goal.
And we know that many of them have. They get
Right.
they get adopted
right.
by courses and course
right.
adoptions. And I said earlier that no matter what the stories were that you were covering, if you look at them deeply enough, you come back to race and class and poverty and these, sort of structural problems that, we have in the country and in Alabama that make it make it make things unfair, unequal. That's the goal of the judges and law clerks and staffers in this very building that we're doing this interview in. Their goal is to administer the law in a way that supports the goals and ideals of the country, which we haven't always lived up to, but we keep working. We keep working for them. We keep going forward. We do what John Lewis said. We try to get in good trouble.
Right.
And I do think that is important, and it has usefulness and it has value. And I feel extremely lucky to have been able to do it and do it with you. That we've we got to have all this fun in doing that.
Right.
I've fundamentally though, I think I'm still trying to understand, my own past and the things I, observed from childhood on up. Not that I always understood them or appreciated them, but I was able to try to use that in the work over the years, and and I'm always reminded of the complexity of the racial issue. I remember being with Julian Bond once, and he was giving a talk, and he was being heckled by, some whites in the audience at a college, and one of them yelled out, "Well, all y'all wants are women. That's what you want's are women." And he said, "Let me assure you that I didn't get to be the color that I am because I had an overly aggressive great-grandmother." Now here's a person like Julian, who is one of the smartest, most creative, most courageous workers in the civil rights movement, and at the same time, a real intellectual and a scholar, and it comes out of black educational aristocracy. I mean, there's a picture of him when he was a little boy, and and I think in the picture he's standing there in his short pants, and there are two black men, one on each side of him, holding his hands. And if I'm not mistaken, one of them is his father, Horace Bond, great black educator, and the other is W.E.B. Du Bois. So you take somebody like Julian, who comes out of that background and then gets to spend his lifetime trying to bring change and create. And he understands these issues. He never quit being a Southerner. He never quit working. John Lewis, same thing. Many others, the people I've named, whose books we've done and whose stories we've told. And the story is complicated. The relations are complicated. To try to tease that out and to understand it, to understand your place within it, that takes a long time, and determination not to get discouraged and to give up, and to try to see if you can figure out a way to help people who haven't had quite the same ability to get out of that crippling racial past. And yet you still got to remember how complicated it is. And I think I think I'm about done, but I will close by telling, if I can remember how to put it. So when I was in college, no, actually, I was already working at the Birmingham News. When I was working at the Birmingham News, my grandfather, Grady Smith, died. And there in Abanda, he was quite reasonably young. He was 63. He was plowing in the field with his mule in the afternoon. He went to sleep at night, never woke up. And his body was taken to the funeral home, and then it was brought back to the house. This is the little dog trot house. And his casket was opened, and there he was in the living room of the house. When I got, when I drove down from Birmingham, my then wife and we drove down to Birmingham, and were met by my tearful grandmother and all the people around. And there's, Granddaddy and his casket set up, I guess, sawhorses or something, whatever it was set up on, in front of the fireplace, and open. And there he was. And you don't see that. That used to be common. It's rare that you have that kind of thing anymore, but there it was. And so then, he was buried, and Granny continued to live there for a good number of years, and she developed glaucoma and was going blind, and she really couldn't stay out there much longer. Meanwhile, Matthew had died. So here were these two widowed, poor white woman and poor black woman, these two women living out there on their farms. Husband's dead, and they're just subsisting out there. And Granny stayed there until the glaucoma was beginning to blind her to the point that she really couldn't live alone. And then she moved to Florida to live with my oldest aunt down there. But a couple of years after Granddaddy's death, I drove down to visit. And it was summertime. It was in the afternoon. I drove down to Birmingham to visit. And she was sitting out on the front porch. Sorry. So she's sitting out on the front porch with little A. They're shelling peas or beans or something and talking. And so I pull up in the yard, and I get out, and I go up, and I'm shelling beans, talking with them, and they're carrying on a good conversation. Two neighbors, just as contented as they could be. And by now it's getting dark, and Little A's house is about a quarter of a mile up the road, up the hill, dirt road. And it's getting dark, and she's got to leave because they know street lights, and not a street light within 10 miles of there. And furthermore, she needs to get home before it gets completely dark, because the road heats up during the day, and snakes will come out and lay in the road. After it cools down, the snakes will come out and lay in the road because the road's still warm. Anyway, she certainly didn't want to step on a snake while she's heading home. So she gets up and says her goodbyes and leaves. And so it's about, 50 yards from, 50, 75 yards from Granny's front porch out to the end of her driveway and then the dirt road and then up to Little A's house. And so Little A's left and she's walking down the driveway and down the lane, and she's kind of, as she's going out of sight. My grandmother says to me with great tenderness and emotion, she says in her voice, she says, "There goes a good nigger." Now, she did not mean any hurt at all. I think she loved that woman, and I think she loved her back. They lived together for 50 years, plus 50 years they'd lived out there together on this dirt road. But that's what she said. And what the word that she said, she didn't use it as a racial epithet. I'm not excusing her using it. Don't misunderstand me. But she didn't use it that way. She used it because that was her white, poor Alabama culture that she, unlike her grandson, had not been able to unlearn. But her use of it was, to me, just a crystal example of the complicated relationships between white and black Alabamians and white and black Southerners. And, I am hopeful that the part of her expression that was of devotion and friendship, I'm hoping that is or can become our legacy.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.